Welcome to Miss Taylor's class notes. So today is lesson 1, unit 1 of solving equations. So we're going to talk about solving 1 and 2 step equations. And first we're going to talk about vocabulary. So the first thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about our constant term. So our constant term is a number without a variable. And remember, variables are represented by letters. So if we're looking at this problem here to the right, x is my variable, which makes my constant term -3 because it is all by itself. That is my constant. Next, we're going to talk about variable term. A variable term is a term with a variable. And again, remember that variables are represented by letters. So what we're looking for is we're looking for our letter. So here is our x, and the term is going to be everything until we hit a plus or a minus sign. So this is my variable term. Next, we're going to talk about coefficients. So coefficients are going to be the numbers in front of variables in our variable term. So again, I'm looking for my variable or my letter, which is an x, and if it's a coefficient, it's going to be the number in front. So 3 is my coefficient. And then one last little bit of vocab we need to go over is we need to go over equations. Equations are math problems with an equal sign. And so we're looking for that equal sign. That tells us an equation. It also tells us that we can solve the problem. So equations we can solve. So in this next little part right here, I want you, using our definitions from above, to identify the constant term, identify the variable, and I want you to identify the coefficient. And then I want you to check the completed class notes to see if you got it correct. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to talk about our basic mathematical operations, and then we're going to talk about the inverse of them. So in this first problem right here, we have x plus 7, and so our mathematical operation that is happening is addition or adding. In our next problem, it's a minus 5, so the mathematical operation is subtract. In our next one, we have 2y. Anytime I have a letter next to a number, that means multiply. And then finally, we have z over 8, and z, sometimes we say it is z divided by 8, so this means divide. So when we're solving equations, we need to know the inverse or the opposite. So the opposite of adding is subtract. The opposite of subtract is to add. The opposite of multiply is to divide. And then the opposite of divide is to multiply. And so as we're solving equations, to solve them, we have to do that inverse. So we need to make sure we recognize what those are so that we know what the opposite is. All right, so now we're going to solve equations. We have our first step is always going to be to add and subtract our constant term, which is the term that does not have the variable. And then our final step is almost always going to be multiply or divide by our coefficient. So I'm going to do our first step in blue, and I'm going to do our second step in green. So x minus 7, I'm looking for my constant. So my constant is my number and its sign that does not have a letter. So to move it to the other side of the equation, I have to do the inverse. So if it's a subtract 7, I need to change it to an add 7, and what I do to one side, I have to do to the other. A -7 plus 7 cancels out to 0, which means I need to bring down my x, and then 3 plus 7 is 10. And that is our answer. That is a simple one-step equation. So on this next problem, I don't have a constant, I have a coefficient. My coefficient is the number and its sign that are right next to the variable. So any number next to a variable tells me to multiply. The opposite of multiply means I need to divide. When I divide, my -3 over -3 cancels out. That leaves me with an A, and then 9 divided by -3 is -3. So A equals -3. On this last one, 2 isn't really a coefficient, and it's not really a constant, but it is being divided. And so when it's being divided, I need to do the opposite, which means I need to multiply. And so I'm going to multiply both sides by 2. When I multiply, these cancel out. I'm left with a Z, and then 14 times 2 is 28. All right, so on these next problems, everything is going to have a constant and a coefficient. So again, our constant is the number and the sign in front of it that does not have a variable. So I need to do the opposite operation, which means subtract. And what I do to one side, I do to the other. They cancel. I'm left with a -9c equals 82 minus 1 is 81. Then I'm going to divide by my coefficient, or the number next to the c. A number next to a letter means multiply, so the opposite means to divide. So once I divide, 81 divided by -9 is going to be a -9. I'm going to let you do this next one and check it with the notes. And I'm going to do this next one right here. So we need to find our constant. Our constant is the number and the sign without a letter. We need to do the opposite. So if it's positive, we need to change it to negative. And what I do to one side, I do to the other. The 5s on that side cancel. I bring down the -4y. And then -5 and a -15 tells me that I'm going to keep the negative and add the two numbers together. So now the number next to my letter is the -4, which is my coefficient. A number next to a letter means multiply. The opposite is to divide. When I have two negatives, they become a positive. So 20 divided by 4 becomes a +5. And so 5 equals y. This is a perfectly fine answer. If you want to switch it to y equals 5, you're more than welcome to. Both of those mean the same thing. All right, I'm going to have you do this next one on your own and check it with the class notes. And then finally, we're going to do this one here. So I need to get rid of the number on the bottom. Again, this one, technically it's a constant, but we're going to have to multiply or divide it. So the opposite of division is multiply. So I'm going to multiply by 7. That's going to cancel out this 7. I bring the t minus 5 down here. And then 6 times 7 should be 42. Now I actually have a constant because the -5 is by itself. It is not next to the t. I need to flip the sign. What I do to one side, I do to the other. So t is going to equal 47. And again, I want you to do this problem as well and then check it with the class notes.